Welcome. Please comment where you're watching from in the world. He was younger than me by just enough years for it to feel like a gap rather than a chasm. 21, maybe 22. Old enough to drive, to rent his own place, to talk about plans in a vague way, but still wrapped in the freshness of someone who had not yet been worn down by the repetition of years. There was a sweetness about him that had disarmed me during our chats. He responded quickly, punctuating his sentences with emojis that felt more like nervous laughter than performative charm. He asked about my day with genuine curiosity, never in the perfunctory way people use to get from greeting to arrangement. He said things like, "I'm just looking to meet someone chill, and not trying to waste anyone's time," and I believed him because he sounded like someone who didn't yet know how to lie well. When he asked to come over, I agreed. There was no long prelude, no dinner or drinks or elaborate seduction planned. It was straightforward, a meeting of two people who wanted something easy, casual, a little escape from the weight of everything else. My apartment was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that makes the refrigerator hum sound louder than usual. I set out a couple of glasses of water, not wine, because he hadn't asked for anything more, and it felt like water was the right choice for someone so new to all this. When I opened the door, he stood there with his hands in his hoodie pocket, rocking slightly on his heels like a student waiting outside a classroom. His face lit up when he saw me, and it was a nervous light, like a candle fighting against a breeze. He stepped inside, glancing around with a curiosity that felt shy rather than invasive. He didn't sit down right away, but lingered near the kitchen as though unsure of the choreography. We began talking, lightly at first, small pieces of our lives offered like tokens. He told me about his classes, about working part-time at a coffee shop, about friends who still lived like they were in high school. His voice had that eager rhythm, too quick sometimes, but not unpleasant. I listened, smiling, sensing that what he wanted most in that moment was to be seen, to have someone nod along and confirm that yes, the details of his life mattered. When I leaned back against the counter, he stepped closer. The conversation thinned, not awkwardly, but in that way conversations do when another language starts to press at the edges, the language of proximity, of silence, of waiting. He moved between my knees where I sat on the counter, his body tentative but trying for confidence. His hand brushed mine, then my waist, and then his lips found mine. The kiss was warm, a little clumsy, the way first kisses often are when people haven't yet mapped each other's rhythms. He leaned into it with an intensity that surprised me, as though he had been holding his breath and finally found air. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on the counter beside me, not in fear but in concentration. I kissed him back, gently, not rushing. There was no need. And then it happened. At first, I wasn't entirely sure what was unfolding. His breath hitched, his body stiffened, and the kiss grew suddenly frantic, uncoordinated. He pressed closer, almost too close, and then his whole body shuddered with a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. He pulled back, face flushed, eyes darting away from mine as though trying to find an escape hatch in the air itself. His chest rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths, and in that silence, the realization settled in with a clarity that almost made me laugh. He had finished. Right there, in the middle of the kiss. The moment was surreal, and yet it wasn't funny in the way a story might later become when retold over drinks. It was too raw, too unguarded. He looked at me then, eyes wide with embarrassment so sharp it almost hurt to meet them. He didn't say sorry. He didn't say anything at all. He just stepped back, muttered something incoherent, and moved quickly toward the door. I called his name, softly, not to stop him but to ease the harshness of the silence. He didn't turn around. He pulled the door shut behind him, leaving me in the kitchen with the refrigerator hum and the glass of water still sweating on the counter. For a long time, I just sat there on the counter, my lips tingling faintly with the ghost of the kiss, my mind replaying the scene in quiet loops. I wasn't angry. How could I be? There was nothing malicious in what had happened. It was simply human, achingly human, the kind of awkwardness that can only come from being both too young and too eager. But beneath the awkwardness was something else, a tenderness almost. A reminder of what it means to be vulnerable in front of another person, to risk humiliation in pursuit of intimacy. I thought about him on his drive home, cheeks burning, replaying the moment in his own head, probably wishing he could rewind time and slow himself down, maybe cursing his body for betraying him. I imagined him walking into his apartment, dropping his hoodie on the floor, and sitting on the edge of his bed in silence, wondering if he'd ever recover from the shame. I hoped, for his sake, that he would. Everyone has a moment like that, maybe not the same, but similar. A moment where your body and your intentions refuse to align, where desire outruns capacity. The only difference is that most of us get to bury those moments in privacy. He had to live his in front of someone else. I never heard from him again. No texts, no apologies, no awkward jokes to smooth over the jagged edge of memory. His silence wasn't cruel, it was self-preservation. To reach out would mean confronting the moment head-on, and he wasn't ready for that. Maybe he never would be. And I didn't chase him, because some silences are kinder left unbroken. Over the weeks that followed, the story settled into my memory not as a humiliation, but as a strange sort of parable. It made me think about expectation, how often we construct elaborate ideas of what intimacy should look like, only for the reality to arrive uninvited and imperfect. It made me think about kindness, and how easy it is to laugh at someone's mistake when you forget how exposed we all are in those moments. And it made me think about youth, that fragile space where you're desperate to prove yourself yet constantly tripping over the evidence of how much you still have to learn. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the kitchen late at night, I still think about him, the boy with nervous emojis, who kissed me with too much urgency, who left without a goodbye. I wonder who he is now, whether he's learned to laugh about it, whether he's found someone who kissed him again after the silence, and helped him discover a rhythm his body could follow. I hope he has. Because in his awkwardness, in his inability to stay, he gave me something too, a reminder that intimacy isn't a performance. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and sometimes it's over before it begins. That night, after he left, I poured the water down the sink and let the faucet run longer than necessary, as if I could wash the strangeness from the room. Fig, my cat, patted in and rubbed against my leg, indifferent to human rituals and mistakes. I scooped him up, burying my face in his fur, grateful for the uncomplicated warmth of his presence. The apartment felt steady again, though I knew the story would linger. Not as tragedy, not as comedy, but as a quiet chapter in the endless book of how people find each other, and how often they don't. He arrived with the weather still on him, a cool dampness clinging to his jacket, as if the street hadn't decided whether to let him go. I opened the door because that's what people do when they have agreed to be visited, and he stepped past me with a nod that seemed practiced, a nod he'd given to hosts and receptionists and crossing guards all his life. He didn't ask about shoes or hangers or where to set his keys. He kept them in his palm like a small anchor. My cat, Fig, watched from the couch arm, tail curling and uncurling with the metronomic patience of someone who understands the house better than I do. The room carried the faint, friendly smell of laundry detergent and 2-day-old lilies. The lamp in the corner hummed with the effort of being gentle. I said hello again because the first hello had felt too small for the doorway. He said hello back, eyes sliding over me to take inventory of the space, of the window cracked an inch, of the glass of water already sweating on the coffee table, of the hallway narrow as a promise. There was a softness to his face that most people might call shy. It wasn't unkind. It just belonged to someone who had learned economy the hard way, economy of words, of time, of decisions. I found myself filling the air out of habit, the way you top off a glass when you aren't sure anyone else will. I mentioned the bus route that runs late, the neighbor who plays the trumpet very earnestly between 9 and 10, the heat that sticks in old pipes unless you coax it with patience. He laughed in the right place when I mentioned the trumpet, not so much amused as acknowledging that the sentence had asked to be laughed at. There was nothing threatening about him, not in the obvious sense. He was smaller than I expected, slighter, as if a good gust might shift him 2 inches to the left. He looked past me at Fig, then away, then back, the way people do when they do not know the rules for approaching animals or the humans who love them. We had agreed, in silhouettes and implication, on something easy and adult. I am not always good at easy. I am unfailingly good at adult. The chat had been impersonal by design, a location, a time, an assurance wrapped in casual punctuation. When I texted him the building code, he replied with a thumbs up, a tiny cartoon that felt less like consent than like permission to proceed to the next screen. I had opened the window because the apartment goes still when I am thinking too much about what will happen next, and a thin stripe of November air helps the rugs breathe. He stood inside the door a moment longer, like someone just off a train waiting for the platform to announce itself, and then he crossed to the middle of the room and stopped, as if he'd reached the red X on a map only he could see. There is a particular stillness that occurs when a script in your head falls out of your hands, and you decide, with a private exhale, that you are not going to lunge for it. He didn't lunge either. He did the opposite of that, which was to act as though everything necessary had already been said or thought, and that the remaining task was as simple as setting a bag down and picking another up. He did not reach for me. He did not even orient himself in my direction. There was something almost ceremonial in the way he kept his gaze soft and somewhere else, as if the presence of another person at the edge of his vision would complicate an equation he had come here to solve. The lamp clicked once, as if adjusting to the new weather. Fig made a sound faint as punctuation. I have been in rooms where people did not mean me harm, and still managed harm by failing to notice the shape of me. That is not the same as danger, but it lives in the same neighborhood. I felt it arrive the way you sense a neighbor's music through the wall. Not loud, but insistent, a reminder that you share a structure with other people's needs. When he began to touch himself, it was with the efficiency of someone following instructions off a page. No flourish, no performance, no attempt to loop me into the circle of intention. If this were a stage, he had placed me just off the light, so he could pretend the audience was an empty room. There are words for discomfort that sound like alarms, but this didn't feel like a siren or a shout. It felt like standing in a line you thought was for coffee, and realizing at the counter that everyone else ordered something you don't drink. There are choices available in long seconds that are not available in short ones. I could have spoken, and maybe I should have. I could have crossed the room and placed a hand on his arm and altered the axis of the moment. Instead, I watched myself perform a smaller choice. I stayed still and took an inventory, the habit of a person trained by polite rooms. The window, the door, the distance between us measured by the kind of steps that do not make rugs shift. The voices of my better friends saying, "You can stop this whenever you want," said without judgment, said like you hand someone a coat when the wind changes. He didn't look at me. He looked not at the ceiling, but at that blank space people choose when they are trying to occupy only one sense at a time. He breathed like someone finishing a chore. I will not pretend there was heroism in my silence, because there was not. There was a certain study in it, a scholar's interest in how people move when they believe they are alone. When it ended without drama. He pulled himself back into the assemblage of a person meant for walking through hallways and pressing elevator buttons and catching a door with his foot for the person behind him. He glanced toward me then, head tilted as if hearing an echo, and said thanks, in the tone people use when the cashier has put the receipt in the bag without asking. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It was an utterance that left no handhold. He did not look embarrassed. Embarrassment would have reached for me and asked to be carried together. He looked relieved, like a traveler upon finding the right platform, and then he left. The door made its familiar sound, that small rubbery kiss of steel meeting frame. The hallway breathed, the building's lungs pushing a sigh through vents and floorboards, and the silence that followed had a new weight to it, as if someone had set a book on an already full shelf. Fig jumped down from the couch and traversed the room in that careful gait cats adopt when they sense the ground may have changed in a way visible only to them. He sniffed the spot where the stranger had stood, then looked up at me with the unobtrusive skepticism of old friends. It was not judgment, it was inquiry. Cats do not worry about story, they worry about territory. I knelt and scratched the fur between his ears until his skepticism turned into the feline equivalent of a shrug. Never again. He was 46 years old, though the number clung to him the way a birth date clings to a document. Technically accurate, but not really descriptive of the person in front of me. If you'd asked me then, I might have said he was a boy preserved in amber, a creature who had been caught mid-laugh sometime around 1999 and never fully escaped. His hair was thinning but styled with the careful optimism of someone who still remembered when hair gel was currency. His jeans were a little too loose, his sneakers pristine enough to suggest they were bought not for running, but for appearances. He had that bounce in his step that people sometimes mistake for charm, but which often reveals itself to be restlessness, an inability to stand still in one's own company. Our first 3 dates had been benign, if not particularly memorable. Dinner at a casual Italian place where he insisted the calamari wasn't as good as in college. Drinks at a bar where he performed jokes with the easy volume of someone accustomed to being heard. A walk through the downtown area where he pointed out buildings he thought he remembered, though I doubted he had ever really looked at them before. He wasn't unkind, nor was he cruel. He simply seemed to live at a different tempo, his presence wound tighter than mine, as though every moment carried the potential for a punchline or a pratfall. By the 4th date, I had already begun to weigh the balance sheet of whether to continue. Nothing glaring had gone wrong, but nothing had gone right either. He suggested dinner at his place, and I agreed, partly because I wanted to know if the boyishness was a costume that melted when he was on his home turf. His apartment was neat, almost too neat, the kind of neatness that signals either meticulousness or avoidance. The furniture was basic but new. The walls had the bland neutrality of a model home. There was little evidence of a life lived, no bookshelves, no family photos, no half-finished projects on the counter. The only personal touch was a massive framed print of a college football game, frozen mid-play, the crowd blurred into a sea of anonymous applause. We ate takeout on the couch, and he talked about old friends he still texted, about parties in his 20s that had blurred into epic nights, about jobs that never stuck but were always just stepping stones. I nodded and listened, and though part of me found the stories shallow, another part noticed the undercurrent. He clung to those memories the way a swimmer clings to a floating log, not because it is luxurious, but because it is what keeps you from drifting under. After dinner, he stood abruptly, an energy flashing through him, as though he had been waiting for the curtain to rise. "Want to see something?" he asked, already heading down the hallway toward his bedroom. His grin had a rehearsed brightness to it, the kind you see in a child about to perform a trick that has been done 1,000 times, but is still, to them, miraculous. I followed, hesitant but curious. His bedroom was as bare as the rest of the apartment, bed neatly made, a nightstand with no books or water glass, blinds drawn tight. He turned to me with the mischievous look of someone about to reveal a secret door. "Check this out," he said. Then, without hesitation, he sprinted across the room and leapt into the air, curling his legs to his chest like a schoolboy at a swimming pool. For a moment, it was almost impressive. The height, the commitment, the sheer childish absurdity of it all. But the instant his body collided with the mattress, the bed frame gave way. The wood splintered with a crack so loud I felt it in my teeth. The mattress sagged into the crater of broken slats, swallowing him half whole. A puff of dust rose like smoke, and the headboard tipped forward until it rested against the wall with a resigned sigh. He lay there in the ruins of his own bed, grinning broadly, arms spread as if he had just landed a gymnast's routine. "Still got it," he announced, breathless but proud. He looked at me expectantly, as if applause was the next natural step in this performance. I stood in the doorway, unable to move. The scene was surreal. A grown man half submerged in the wreckage of his own furniture, smiling as though destruction was proof of vitality. The lamp flickered with the vibration of the impact. My first instinct was to laugh. It was absurd, undeniably absurd, but something in the moment kept me still. It wasn't just the broken bed, it was the way he seemed to revel in it, as if breaking things was his way of proving he was alive. "Are you okay?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I expected. "Bed's old," he replied, brushing splinters from his shirt with casual nonchalance. "Been meaning to replace it anyway." But I had seen the bed before it broke. It hadn't looked old. It had looked functional, steady, sufficient. His words felt like an insult to the object itself, a rewriting of its story to absolve himself of the violence he'd done to it. He pulled himself upright, the mattress groaning under his weight. For a moment, I thought he might try to pull me onto the wreckage, to insist we salvage the evening atop the ruins. And indeed, he did gesture, patting the space beside him with an inviting grin. "We can still, you know." His tone was suggestive, conspiratorial, as if the broken bed was now a secret we shared, a private joke. But I heard something else. I heard the groan of the splintered wood, the sigh of the tilted headboard, the complaint of screws that had held as long as they could and had finally given up. It was as if the bed itself was protesting, warning me, refusing to be complicit in whatever came next. I shook my head and forced a polite smile. "I should probably get going," I said, citing an early morning that didn't exist. He tried to persuade me with another grin, with boyish insistence that it was no big deal, just a laugh, just a story. But my mind had already left the apartment, carrying with it the sound of breaking wood and the image of a man suspended midair, forever choosing impact over stillness. I left him standing in the ruins of his own performance, dust in his hair like confetti, waiting for an applause that would not come. In the hallway, the silence felt newly sacred. The elevator doors closed with a softness that felt like mercy. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the way he had celebrated the break instead of acknowledging it. I thought about how some people treat their lives as a series of cannonballs, dramatic leaps followed by impact, chaos framed as proof of vitality. They call it charm, call it fun, call it living in the moment. But behind it is a trail of broken things, bed frames, conversations, relationships, trust. Always moving, always leaping, never standing still long enough to see the wreckage they leave behind. I realized then that the boy preserved in amber wasn't frozen at all. He was still bouncing, still hurling himself against the structures meant to hold him. And those structures, whether wood or women, always seemed to give way in the end. It started like so many unremarkable evenings. A movie, something we both agreed on after a few exchanged messages about genre preferences. He wasn't charming, exactly, but he had that plain kind of friendliness that makes you think an uneventful evening is the worst that could happen. I told myself that sometimes uneventful is good. Sometimes uneventful is safety. The apartment was tidy in a way that suggested recent effort. Surfaces wiped down, coasters placed under glasses that didn't need them, a faint citrus cleaning smell lingering in the air. The lights were dimmed just enough to make the television the main event. He didn't sit too close, didn't make sudden moves, didn't reach for me the way some men do too quickly. For the first hour, I thought maybe this would become one of those forgettable stories I'd tell later with a shrug. Nice guy, nothing special, not my type. But after the credits rolled, the mood shifted. He didn't stand, didn't walk me to the door or ask if I wanted another drink. He just sat there, staring at the black screen as if waiting for something else to appear. I reached for my bag, a polite signal, and he finally spoke. "Let's watch another one," he said, his voice casual but firm, the way you might say it's time for dessert when no one asked for it. I laughed lightly, the practiced laugh women use to soften their refusals. "I should probably head out. Early morning." His head turned toward me slowly. "Stay," he said, not pleading, not joking. A statement. The room felt smaller then, though nothing had changed. I tried to keep my tone light. "Really, I should go. It was fun, though." Something in his expression didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on mine longer than necessary, and then he looked back at the television. "Another movie," he repeated. I excused myself to the bathroom, smiling as though it were the most natural request in the world. My hand shook only slightly as I turned the lock. Once inside, I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with the efficiency of instinct. "Call me in 5 minutes. Emergency tone. I need to leave." The message went to my best friend. Then, because the unease was heavier than I wanted to admit, I dialed the police. My voice was calm, deliberate. I explained I felt unsafe, that a man was refusing to let me leave, that I needed assistance. They said someone would be there soon. I stayed in that bathroom longer than necessary, listening to the silence on the other side of the door. It was not the silence of someone scrolling their phone or pouring a drink. It was the silence of someone arranging themselves, waiting. When the knock came, not at the bathroom, but at the front door, I knew it wasn't him. Relief rushed through me, but it collided with another sound that froze me, a dragging, a soft clatter, the scrape of metal against wood. By the time I emerged, the police had already entered. Their voices were steady, professional, carrying that tone meant to calm everyone at once. And then I saw the table. Every knife he owned was spread across it, arranged with a kind of obsessive precision from smallest to largest. Paring knives, steak knives, a serrated bread knife, a cleaver that caught the light like a grin. Each one laid out on clean towels, as if prepared for surgery or ritual. He stood beside them, his hands loose at his sides, expression unreadable. The officers moved quickly, stepping between us, asking him questions I couldn't hear through the rushing in my ears. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He simply watched me with a strange calmness, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite neutral either. And then, in the quiet space between their words, I saw his mouth form shapes I could still recognize. "Next time." They escorted him out, their hands guiding him firmly, but not violently. He didn't look back at the knives. He didn't need to. They had already done their work, not in action but in implication. I sat down because my legs demanded it. The officers asked me questions, practical things. Did I know him well? Had he threatened me? Had he touched me? I answered as best I could, though my voice kept catching on the strangeness of it all. No, he hadn't threatened me. No, he hadn't touched me. And yet, there on the table, the threat had been alive, undeniable, breathing in the neat alignment of steel. They told me I had done the right thing. That was the phrase, the right thing, as though safety were a moral decision rather than a human need. They gave me a case number, handed me a slip of paper that suddenly felt too flimsy for the weight of what had just happened. When they left, the apartment was still, except for the knives. The officers hadn't taken them. They weren't evidence of a crime, not technically. They were just kitchen tools, after all. Their arrangement might have been explained away by some eccentricity, some harmless ritual of cleaning. But I knew better. I could still feel the intention hanging in the air like smoke. I gathered my things quickly, my hands moving faster than my thoughts. My eyes kept darting back to the table, to the cold reflection of the ceiling light in each blade. It felt wrong to leave them there, exposed, as though they might rearrange themselves in my absence. But they weren't mine to touch, and I wanted no further contact with anything he had owned. The hallway outside smelled of old carpet and neighbors cooking, so normal it nearly undid me. I walked briskly to my car, every sound amplified, the click of my heels, the creak of the elevator, the slam of the door behind me. When I finally sat behind the wheel, I locked the doors before even turning the key. My breath fogged the windshield, and for a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to drive. Later, when I tried to explain the evening to friends, the words felt thin. They laughed nervously, said it sounded like a scene from a bad thriller. I smiled along, but inside I knew it hadn't been cinematic. It had been quiet, calculated, deliberate. The knives hadn't been props. They had been a message. What unsettled me most wasn't the potential for violence, though that lingered like a shadow. It was the patience. The way he had sat there, insisting on another movie. The way he had taken his time arranging the knives, knowing I was in the bathroom just feet away. The way he had smiled as though this was all rehearsal, and I had interrupted him mid-scene. For weeks afterward, I avoided movies at home. I avoided men who insisted on plans at their apartments. I avoided silence that stretched too long. The memory wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It crept into the edges of ordinary moments, a reminder that the line between uneventful and terrifying is thinner than anyone wants to believe. The first date was ordinary in the way first dates often are. We met for drinks at a bar that didn't ask much of us. Dim lighting, music loud enough to cover silences, waitstaff practiced in smiling at couples who looked like they weren't sure if they were couples. He was polite, a little nervous, though that wasn't unusual. He asked questions, made eye contact, laughed in the right places. I left thinking he was nice, not extraordinary, but harmless enough. When we hugged in the parking lot, it was the kind of hug that says thank you for coming out, thank you for trying. Nothing in that moment suggested that the night would become anything more than a memory that would fade quickly. I drove away, relieved in that subtle way you often are when a date hasn't gone badly, but also hasn't convinced you to rearrange your week for a second one. I didn't want to go straight home, though. Sometimes after dates I needed to cleanse the air with something banal. So I decided on Target. A store aisle feels steady in a way a bar conversation never does. I could lose myself in fluorescent light, in the rows of detergent and toothpaste and the gentle hum of normal life. But when I pulled into the Target parking lot, my stomach tightened. He was there, leaning against his car, parked a few rows down from the entrance, staring casually in my direction, as though we had planned to meet again. At first I told myself it had to be coincidence. Maybe he needed something from the store. Maybe he lived nearby. But he didn't walk toward the entrance. He stayed by his car, hands in his pockets, watching. I went inside anyway, though I bought nothing. I couldn't stop myself from glancing through the sliding glass doors every few minutes. His car hadn't moved. His posture was unchanged. A coincidence, I told myself again, but the word was beginning to feel thin. I decided not to linger. I left the store, deliberately turning in the opposite direction, and drove to Best Buy. The parking lot was brighter there, more open, the kind of place that feels exposed rather than concealed. For a moment, relief settled in. Surely this time, he wouldn't follow. But as I parked and glanced around, my chest tightened once more. He was there, too. Different car placement, same casual lean, same hands in pockets, as though he had been waiting for me to arrive. I tried to shake the panic rising in me, tried to tell myself that there could be reasons, improbable but possible, for this strange repetition. Maybe he really did have errands to run. Maybe the city was smaller than it seemed. But the logic was fraying now, and instinct was louder. I hurried inside, wandering among televisions that blasted scenes of oceans and cities collapsing in cinematic clarity. I pretended to study price tags, but my eyes kept darting toward the glass doors. He didn't enter the store. He didn't even pretend to shop. He simply stood outside, patient, present, waiting for the script to continue. My chest felt tight, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of being watched. It is one thing to be seen when you invite it. It is another to feel that your movements are being followed, not by accident, but by intent. I didn't stay long. I walked back to my car briskly, heart thudding, scanning the lot for other witnesses, other bodies that could anchor me. The relief I expected once the door closed around me didn't arrive. Instead, the silence of the car felt suffocating, as though he had stepped inside with me. I drove again, aimlessly this time, trying to decide whether to go home. Home felt too vulnerable. If he was following me, I didn't want him to know where I lived. Starbucks came to mind, not because I needed coffee, but because it promised light noise people. A public place where strangers could be my shield. I parked, walked inside, and ordered something sweet simply to have a name on a cup. The barista wrote it neatly, slid the cup down the counter. I hovered, waiting for the call. When I glanced out the glass doors, my body knew before my mind did. He was there again. Not close, not pressing against the door, but positioned in such a way that I couldn't ignore him. Leaning casually against the railing, as though his body had rehearsed this stance. When our eyes met through the glass, he raised his hand in a small, almost playful wave. It was such a casual gesture, one that might have seemed friendly under any other circumstance. But here, after the bar, after Target, after Best Buy, it was chilling in its normalcy. He wasn't hiding, wasn't pretending. He wanted me to see him, wanted me to know he was there, and he wanted to make it seem harmless. The wave was a performance of innocence, a mask stretched thin. I didn't wave back. I didn't even pick up my drink when my name was called. Instead, I walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the sink, trying to steady my breathing. My phone was in my hand before I'd fully decided what to do with it. I typed out a text to a friend. He's here. He followed me. Starbucks on 5th. If I don't text back in 10 minutes, call. I hovered over the send button, then pressed it with more force than necessary, as though the weight of my thumb could guarantee safety. The bathroom felt too small, too vulnerable, but I stayed until my body stopped shaking. When I finally emerged, the cup with my name had already been taken, perhaps by mistake, perhaps intentionally. I didn't care. I walked toward the side exit, not the front, slipping out into the alley that smelled of trash and wet cardboard. The street was darker there, but it was away from him, and that was all that mattered. I didn't go home that night. I drove to a friend's apartment instead, parking 3 blocks away, and checking the mirrors over and over for headlights that seemed too familiar. My friend opened the door in pajamas, eyes widening at the sight of me. I didn't explain everything right then. I just said I didn't want to be alone. She nodded, pulled me inside, and locked the door behind me. In the morning, I told her the whole story, and she said the words I hadn't been ready to admit to myself. That's stalking. I wanted to argue, to downplay, to tell myself that maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was a misunderstanding. But the memory of his wave at Starbucks silenced me. That small, casual flick of his hand had carried too much intent to ignore. I never saw him again after that night. He didn't text, didn't call, didn't try to reach out. It was as if his presence evaporated, leaving behind only the residue of dread. But the memory lingered. When I walked into stores, I found myself scanning the parking lot before entering. When I sat at a cafe, I positioned myself facing the door. Safety, I learned, is not only the absence of threat, it is the belief that your movements are your own. Once that belief is cracked, it takes a long time to mend. He called it a studio, though the word seemed to tremble in the air like a balloon about to deflate. When I arrived, he swung the door open with the enthusiasm of a man unveiling a secret. The hinges squeaked as though they disagreed. The space was a garage, unmistakably so, despite his attempts at reinvention. A concrete floor that still smelled faintly of oil, string lights sagging from thumbtacks like exhausted smiles, and a beanbag chair in the corner that looked as though someone had been swallowed by it long ago and never returned. "This is where the magic happens," he said, sweeping his arm theatrically, and I almost asked what kind of magic, but thought better of it. The air was cool, damp in the way enclosed spaces get when they're asked to be something they are not. He had lined one wall with posters, bands I half recognized, abstract art torn from magazines, a page of inspirational quotes that looked like it had been printed at work and cut out with office scissors. On a low shelf sat a small Bluetooth speaker, its blinking light valiantly filling the silence with lo-fi beats that seemed embarrassed to be there. He offered me a drink, and I accepted, hoping for something that would make the room feel less unfinished. He rummaged in a cooler tucked under the workbench and produced a can of seltzer, warm to the touch, the condensation long gone. "Ran out of ice," he explained with a grin. I smiled politely and sipped anyway, the carbonation sharp on my tongue, a reminder that not everything flat deserves patience. We talked, or rather, he talked, about how garages are misunderstood spaces, about how minimalism isn't just a lifestyle but a revolution, about how possessions trap us into thinking we are permanent. He gestured to the emptiness around us, as though it were proof of enlightenment rather than eviction. I nodded where appropriate, the way you do when you recognize that someone isn't really speaking to you, but to the version of themselves they like best. At some point, I excused myself. "Bathroom?" I asked, letting the word carry its full weight of necessity. He blinked, as though the concept itself had surprised him, then pointed vaguely toward the driveway. "Convenience store. Just a short walk," he said, as if outsourcing basic plumbing was a bold architectural choice rather than a flaw. I stepped outside, grateful for the cold night air, and followed his directions. The street was nearly empty, save for a loose shutter clicking against a building in the wind, keeping time with the absurdity of my evening. The convenience store glowed ahead, fluorescent and forgiving. Inside, the clerk looked at me with the practiced benevolence of someone who has seen worse at stranger hours. I used the restroom, washed my hands twice, and lingered longer than necessary among the aisles of chips and candy, comforted by the hum of refrigeration units and the neat geometry of packaged goods. On the walk back, I passed a house where a family was eating dinner. The window was fogged with laughter, silhouettes leaning toward each other over a table that looked too small for their abundance. It was the kind of ordinary scene that can feel almost holy when you've just come from a garage that insists on calling itself a studio. When I returned, he had cued a video on minimalism, the narrator's voice solemn and insistent, explaining how chairs are unnecessary and beds are indulgences. The volume was just high enough to feel like an argument. He muted it when I entered, as though embarrassed to be caught in the act of being educated. We sat together on the beanbag, which exhaled under our weight like an old dog resigned to company. The fabric was worn smooth in places, sticky in others. He leaned back comfortably, his arm brushing mine in a way that was probably intentional. He began talking about how bathrooms are social constructs, about how we only think we need them because society tells us we do. His eyes glowed with the fervor of a prophet, and I thought of the convenience store clerk, the real bathroom, the family in the warm window, and wondered if civilization might be built not on shared values but on shared plumbing. I smiled and nodded because I too have been 23 and convinced that the sound of my own theories was enough to heat a room. There was a tenderness in watching him believe himself so completely, even as I plotted the kindest exit. Eventually, the evening wound down. The lo-fi beat sputtered to an end, the beanbag groaned as we stood, and he walked me to the door with the gallantry of a man who believes he has given a tour of Versailles. "Next time I'll have chairs," he said with a grin, as though furniture was a love language. "Next time I'll bring a toilet," I replied, my smile softer than my words. He laughed, and for a moment we were co-conspirators in the absurdity. The night itself seemed to chuckle too, the wind knocking gently at the siding, the spider descending halfway from a beam before reconsidering its own involvement. I walked to my car with relief blooming in my chest, the cool air washing the smell of damp concrete from my clothes. Driving away, I thought about how dates reveal themselves in layers, sometimes through questions, sometimes through silences, sometimes through the absence of plumbing. We met at a place that looked like it had been designed by a committee with a soft spot for Edison bulbs. The menu listed the provenance of the olives as if we might quiz the bartender, and everyone spoke half a decibel lower than usual, as though the air itself required courtesy. He arrived right on time, shook my hand in a way that suggested he had practiced being dependable, and told me my jacket was very you, which didn't mean much but managed to feel kind anyway. Conversation warmed quickly, the easy kind that loses its edges as soon as the first drink takes the chill off the day. He asked about my job, and I told him the sanitized version. He told me about his, which involved deliverables and client expectations, and the weekly pilgrimage to a salad chain that had convinced him he loved kale. He had an agreeable face, the sort that can nod with conviction about almost anything, and though he did most of the talking, I didn't mind at first. It felt like watching someone pace a room deciding where the sofa should go. Unnecessary, perhaps, but not uninteresting. There is a rhythm to early dates, an alternation of revelation and retreat, and we followed it faithfully. He touched the condensation on his glass the way nervous people do when they need their hands to be employed. I watched the circles his thumb made until they became a quiet metronome. He spoke about travel with the earnestness of someone who thinks a stamped passport is a personality trait. He told me he preferred cities to beaches because he likes a little grit, and I thought, not uncharitably, that grit is what people call inconvenience when they want it to sound like character. When he asked about books, I brightened and said a few titles that had followed me from apartment to apartment like faithful plants. He nodded enthusiastically and confessed he hadn't read anything without an index since graduate school, which I took as honesty rather than failing. Through it all he was pleasant, attentive enough to make me feel witnessed if not wholly seen, and I remember thinking that I could, with minor lifestyle adjustments, imagine a second date. The moment arrived without warning, as these moments do. We had shared a small plate of something drizzled and agreeable, and the server had just cleared the bread that neither of us wanted, but both of us had torn to pieces. He leaned back and crossed his arms in a way that made his watch flash like a road sign, and he smiled at me with a frankness that should have been disarming and somehow wasn't. "You know," he said, as if presenting a considered conclusion, "I probably wouldn't date you, but I would definitely sleep with you." He delivered it with the practiced calm of a man offering a compromise he considered generous, a man who has learned to dress desire as information. I watched the words arrive and settle in the space between us like a glass someone had set down without a coaster, a ring already forming, a small damage no one planned for. I didn't speak right away. Silence is a tool we learn late, after too many times filling the air to make it easier for someone else to breathe. He mistook my quiet for confusion and tried again, clarifying as though I had asked him to sharpen his thesis. "I mean, you're great," he said, gesturing vaguely toward my face as if the features there might volunteer to be enumerated. "But I'm not looking for something serious, and you seem like you might be, you know." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The sentence finished itself. A woman with a job and a spine and a habit of asking questions would, logically, complicate his calendar. He smiled again, encouraging, the way you might smile at a dog you are trying to coax away from a couch it isn't supposed to be on. He wasn't unkind. He was doing what many people do when they have learned to call their own boundaries, honesty, and everyone else's expectations. I could have laughed or rolled my eyes or asked him to consider, with me, the difference between desire and regard. Instead I felt something steadier move into place, a series of small clicks inside my chest, like a jewelry clasp finding the right tooth. I told him thank you for the clarity, and I meant it in the way you mean thank you to the weather report when it tells you the storm won't pass. You don't love the news, but it lets you choose the right shoes. He looked relieved. Men often do when women decline to make a scene, and he reached for the check with a flourish that suggested he was about to mitigate the awkwardness by performing care in its most basic form. I put my hand on the little leather folder before he could, not to punish him, but because the math of paying felt simpler than the algebra of what would follow if I let him be gallant. I flagged the server and handed over my card, and he said, "You don't have to do that," and I said, "I know," which is a sentence that can do a lot of work if you let it. We walked out together because there was no other choreography available, and the street had that soft late-evening traffic that makes everything look slightly more important than it is. He hugged me lightly, the embrace of someone who had already set the memory down somewhere he wouldn't trip over it later. "You're great," he said again, and I nodded in the way women have practiced since adolescence. The nod that means I heard you, it does not mean I agree. He turned left, and I turned right, and the city absorbed us both without comment, which is one of the reasons I love cities. They take everything and ask for nothing in return. Driving home, I let the radio do its job for a few minutes, and then I turned it off because everything it had to say felt like a poster taped over a cracked wall. My thoughts arranged themselves with an efficiency I hadn't expected. I found myself building a museum in my head, each room labeled for a type of almost. There was the gallery of nearly, where the plaques listed the ways I had made myself smaller to fit someone else's sense of scale. There was the wing of if only, full of exhibits where I had spoken in a voice not my own to keep the peace of a dinner table. The central hall was called Almost, and in it hung notes from boys and men who had admired my laugh but not the places it came from, who had loved the way I listened but not the questions that followed, who had adored my body in a way that erased the history written on it. I walked that imaginary hall without bitterness, exactly. What I felt was closer to an archivist's attention, a respect for the accumulated weight of what we carry when we are taught to make ourselves agreeable. At home, the apartment received me with the modest grace of objects that do not ask for stories. I fed the plant I always forget and opened a window an inch because the evening had earned fresh air. In the bathroom, with the small light that makes truth look gentler, I considered my hair and then, with the theatricality of a person giving herself a ceremony, I cut my bangs. They were not good bangs, not in a magazine sense, and they were not meant to be. They were bangs that said, I can alter something that belongs to me without asking permission. I laughed at my uneven handiwork, and the laugh was not self-laceration. It was relief, the kind that arrives when you let yourself be silly in a context where nobody gets hurt. It was supposed to be a light-hearted dinner, one of those dates you agree to because it feels manageable. No elaborate plans, no long drive, just fondue at a little restaurant that tried very hard to be whimsical. The kind of place where the walls were painted with murals of wine barrels and grapevines, where couples leaned in over bubbling pots of cheese and broth, pretending they were continental and sophisticated. We'd met a few times before. He was older than me by a handful of years, comfortable in his body, but not in a way that suggested arrogance. On paper, he was perfectly reasonable. Steady job, no exes hovering in the wings, enough interests to fill the silences. If anything, I expected the evening to be pleasant but forgettable. The server set the pot of broth between us, steam curling upward as though the evening had been staged with atmospheric effects. The little trays of raw meat and vegetables looked delicate, almost toy-like, skewered on long forks with colored ends, so we wouldn't confuse them. I remember thinking that fondue was an oddly intimate meal, cooking together, timing bites, leaning over the same bubbling space. Maybe that intimacy was what drew me to agree to the date in the first place. For a while it was fine. We dipped, we chewed, we laughed about who dropped more pieces into the pot. The broth hissed and spit occasionally, droplets staining the paper napkins in tiny constellations. He talked about his work, about colleagues who seemed trapped in offices forever, about a recent trip he wanted to repeat. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming. And then it happened. He stabbed a piece of steak, lowered it into the broth, and lost it. It slipped off his fork and disappeared into the swirl of boiling liquid. He frowned, peered into the pot, muttered something about clumsy fingers. A moment later, I lifted my own fork, retrieved a cube, and placed it on my plate. That was the moment everything shifted. "That's mine," he said sharply, pointing at my plate. I blinked, confused. "Sorry? That piece of steak, you took mine." I glanced down. The cube looked identical to every other cube. "I just pulled it out of the pot," I said, keeping my tone light, assuming he was joking. But his face had hardened. His voice rose, carrying across the restaurant with a clarity that made heads turn. "You stole it. That was my piece." At first, I laughed nervously, hoping humor would diffuse whatever strange energy had taken hold of him. "They're all the same, aren't they? I'll cook another one." But he didn't soften. His voice grew louder, each word striking like a hammer against the table between us. "No. You took it. That was mine. You don't just take someone else's food like that." The people at the next table froze, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. The server, halfway through pouring wine at another table, turned her head slightly in our direction. My face burned, not from guilt but from the weight of eyes on me. "It's just a piece of steak," I said quietly, trying to contain the situation before it ballooned further. "It's not just steak," he shot back, his hands gripping the table as though anchoring himself. "It's about respect. You don't steal from people. You don't just decide something's yours." He went on like that for several minutes, his words looping in circles, each repetition making the absurdity feel heavier rather than lighter. He talked about fairness, about honesty, about the principle of it all. His voice grew theatrical, almost sermon-like, echoing across the hushed restaurant. I sat there frozen, my appetite gone, my only focus on shrinking small enough to vanish into the upholstery. The server finally approached, placing a gentle hand on the back of his chair. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone professional but laced with caution. "She stole my food," he announced, pointing at me as though I were on trial. "She thinks it's funny. But it's not. It's disrespectful." The server looked at me, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she said evenly, "it's just fondue. If you'd like, I can bring another plate of steak." He huffed but didn't argue with her. She slipped away, leaving me trapped in the echo of his words. When the storm finally subsided into muttering, he leaned across the table, lowering his voice into something conspiratorial. "You know what you can do to make it up to me?" he said, eyes narrowing. I didn't respond. "Invite me back to your place. That would make us even." For a moment, the noise of the restaurant vanished. The bubbling of the pot, the murmur of other conversations, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded beneath the weight of his suggestion. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. He was serious. I stared at him, my body rigid, every instinct screaming at me to end the night right there. I wanted to throw my napkin on the table and walk out, but some stubborn part of me refused to give him the satisfaction of watching me flee. Instead, I forced a neutral smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. "I don't think that's going to happen," I said quietly. His face flickered, annoyance passing over it like a shadow. But he didn't press the point. He sat back, folding his arms, muttering something under his breath about ungrateful people. The server returned with the extra plate of steak, placing it between us with a careful politeness that carried more kindness than anything he'd offered me all night. I thanked her softly, and she gave me the briefest nod of acknowledgement, a flicker of solidarity in the dim light. I didn't eat another bite. I waited until he was distracted by the pot, then excused myself under the pretense of the restroom. Instead, I walked straight out the door, the night air rushing over me like a cleansing wave. I didn't look back. On the drive home, I replayed the evening over and over, incredulous at how quickly something so trivial had become a spectacle. A piece of steak, indistinguishable from the rest, had become the trigger for a display of control, for accusations and demands that revealed more about him than he could have hidden in a year of polite conversation. Later, when I told the story to friends, they laughed at first, because how could you not laugh at someone throwing a tantrum over a cube of meat? But as I retold it, the laughter faded. Beneath the absurdity, there was something darker. It wasn't about the steak. It was about ownership, about control, about turning the smallest accident into an excuse to assert power. I realized that the steak was just a stand-in, a symbol he could twist into justification. What he wanted wasn't food, it was compliance. He wanted me to yield, to apologize, to offer myself as restitution for a crime I hadn't committed. The hotel lobby smelled of lilies and furniture polish, the kind of olfactory blend that pretends elegance while hiding the fatigue of 100 check-ins. I was waiting near the fountain, a half-hearted trickle of water trying to be glamorous, when the manager approached with an expression of practiced warmth. She held out a bottle of champagne, label shining under the light, and pressed it into my hands as if passing on a torch. "Congratulations, Mr. Husband," she said brightly, the words sticking to me like confetti I hadn't asked for. I blinked, confused. "I think you..." She didn't let me finish. "Your wife is exuberant," she added, lowering her voice in the way hotel staff do when they're trying to convey both indulgence and warning. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes hinted at relief, as though a burden had been momentarily shifted onto me. "Wife?" I followed the direction of her gaze and found the source. She was in the lobby planter, barefoot, crown of ivy on her head, announcing to anyone who paused long enough that love was taller than buildings. Her voice carried, not shrill but commanding, the way some people can convince you they are narrating life rather than merely commenting on it. A small crowd had gathered, tourists pausing with luggage, a child clapping uncertainly, an elderly couple smiling at each other with nostalgia that was either real or conveniently summoned. She saw me then, or rather, she decided I was the man she had already chosen in her story. Her arms lifted toward me like a child asking to be carried, her grin wide and insistent. The staff exhaled in visible relief, as if the scene had finally found its protagonist. I could have walked away. I could have insisted she was mistaken, that I was no husband, no participant in this public ceremony. But the momentum of the moment pressed against me, and I found myself stepping forward, playing along because the script was already being performed and the audience was clapping. I took her hand, cool, faintly dirt-streaked from her plantar throne, and guided her down. She giggled, a sound too large for the lobby, and leaned against me as though our bodies had been rehearsing this union for years. The elevator swallowed us with its mirrored walls, her ivy crown slipping slightly as she leaned against the panel of buttons. I pressed 9, though I had no room there, no reservation. It was simply the number my hand chose, perhaps because it seemed both high enough to be special and low enough to make escape plausible. The doors closed on the muffled applause of strangers and the scent of wet leaves clinging to her hair. The room, hers not mine, was softly lit, with the hum of an air conditioner that refused to be silenced. She curled on the bed immediately, shoes abandoned, dress wrinkled from her theatrical performance. The champagne bottle still sat warm in my hand, unopened, heavy with implication. She breathed evenly within minutes, asleep with the reckless innocence of someone who believes the world will tidy itself while she rests. I sat in the armchair, the upholstery rough against my palms, and watched her chest rise and fall. The pulse at the base of the lamp flickered rhythmically, steady as a vow, and I felt as though I had wandered into a marriage without paperwork, a ceremony conjured by willpower alone. I thought of leaving then, slipping out while she dreamed, letting the evening fold itself away as a bizarre anecdote. But I stayed, trapped less by obligation than by curiosity. Who was she when she wasn't playing bride in a hotel lobby? What story had she been telling herself that required me to enter it? And why, despite my better judgment, did I find myself leaning into the quiet theater of it all? At dawn, the room softened into gray. She stirred, sat up, blinked around as if she were waking in a borrowed skin. Her gaze landed on me in the armchair, and confusion chased away the remnants of her dream. "Did we?" she began, her voice cautious. "No," I said simply, shaking my head. The champagne still rested unopened on the table, the foil intact, as though to prove my point. Relief crossed her face, followed by embarrassment that flushed her cheeks. She laughed then, a laugh that held both apology and disbelief. I joined in, because sometimes the only way to step off a bridge that never should have been crossed is to laugh as though it was just a strange dream. We exchanged polite words, the kind of language strangers use to patch over holes. She didn't ask for my name, and I didn't offer it. When I left, the ivy crown remained on the nightstand, wilting quietly, its leaves curling inward as though trying to forget their role in the evening's farce. Later, when I thought about it, the eeriness wasn't in the champagne or the crown, or even in the way the hotel staff had addressed me as her husband. It was in the silence of the room as I sat in the armchair, holding a bottle meant for celebration, watching a stranger sleep as though I had promised to protect her. It was in the way the carpet's pattern repeated like small vows, in the way the siren outside moved slowly past, reluctant to interrupt. It was in the realization that sometimes the world hands you a script, and you act it out, because refusing feels harder than pretending. I never saw her again. She vanished into the city, or perhaps into another hotel lobby, another audience willing to believe for a moment in the story she carried. But every time I open a bottle of champagne now, I remember the weight of that one left sealed. The night it symbolized not joy but the strange, fragile theater of people needing something so badly they make it true for a while. The restaurant was dim in that carefully curated way, the kind of darkness that made candles seem like revelations rather than ordinary wax. Each table had its own small sphere of light, enough to illuminate the plates and faces, but not enough to banish the shadows pooling in the corners. It was a place designed to suggest intimacy, to make every conversation feel like a secret. I had agreed to dinner here because he had insisted, describing it as a setting befitting the kind of ideas he wanted to share. That phrasing alone should have been warning enough, but curiosity is its own trap, and I had walked into it willingly. He was already seated when I arrived, leaning back in his chair with the self-satisfied air of a man rehearsing for a speech. His tie was too tight for the casual atmosphere, his hair combed with an exactness that suggested preparation beyond necessity. He stood quickly, kissed the air near my cheek in a gesture that felt borrowed from a different culture, and guided me to my chair with one hand hovering at my back. The waitress appeared, a slip of grace in black attire, and poured water with the solemnity of a priest offering wine. I opened the menu, scanning the glossy pages, while he folded his hands and looked at me with an intensity that seemed too large for the moment. Before I could choose a dish, he began. "I want to tell you about an opportunity," he said, his tone deliberate, measured, as though rehearsed in a mirror. I smiled politely, waiting for him to elaborate, but he paused, letting the silence settle as though it were the foundation of what would follow. His eyes glittered, not with nerves but with the satisfaction of a man who believes he is unveiling something monumental. He leaned forward slightly. "You know how everyone talks about the miracle of life? About how bringing new life into the world is priceless?" He let the words hang there, waiting for my agreement. I nodded cautiously, unsure where this was going, but unwilling to interrupt. "Well," he continued, his voice rising with enthusiasm, "what if I told you that miracle could be optimized? Monetized, even. A collaboration, a partnership, a venture of sorts. You and me. Limited time offer." I blinked, confused. The waitress reappeared briefly to take our orders, and I clung to the interruption like a life raft. "Bruschetta to share, pasta for me, steak for him." When she left, he resumed without missing a beat, as though we were in the middle of a boardroom presentation rather than a dinner date. "I'm talking about fertility," he said, lowering his voice just slightly, as if revealing classified information. "Eggs, embryos, the whole enterprise. It's the future. Families are investments. Children are assets. And the demand, well, it's endless. Everyone wants a legacy. Everyone wants continuity. And here's the thing, I have the plan. I just need a partner. I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or recoil. His face was utterly serious, his eyes bright with conviction. He reached into his jacket and produced a pamphlet, stapled unevenly, its cover decorated with stock images of smiling babies. He slid it across the table as though handing me a contract. I picked it up, more out of politeness than interest, and flipped through. Clip art, bullet points, vague promises of returns. Words like hope, lineage, and artisanal experiences peppered the pages with all the subtlety of a sales pitch. It read less like a business plan, and more like a parody of one. Think about it, he urged, leaning closer, his voice low and insistent. You're young, healthy, intelligent. We could do something remarkable. I have access to resources, connections in niche markets. With the right branding, we could offer families not just children, but curated experiences of parenthood. A miracle packaged and delivered. Exclusive, bespoke. The absurdity of it pressed against me, yet his conviction was unnerving. He wasn't joking. He believed every word. His hands moved as he spoke, sketching invisible charts in the air. He spoke of frozen assets, chuckling at his own pun, then launched into an explanation of scalability, as though he were pitching a tech startup rather than proposing we commodify human lives. The waitress returned with our food. She placed the bruschetta between us, the pasta steaming in front of me, the steak bleeding quietly on his plate. Her eyes flicked briefly to the pamphlet still lying on the table, and though she said nothing, the corners of her mouth tightened in the faintest suggestion of disapproval. I wanted to ask her to stay, to anchor me to something sane, but she slipped away with the efficiency of someone accustomed to overhearing too much. He cut into his steak with exaggerated precision. The beauty of it is, we don't even need to think long-term. Short contracts, immediate results. And the margins, oh, the margins are phenomenal. He looked at me expectantly, as though I should be dazzled by the numbers he hadn't actually provided. I sipped my water, buying time. My mind raced, not in panic, but in the quiet astonishment of someone realizing they've wandered into a performance they don't understand. His conviction was so complete it felt dangerous to laugh. I set down my fork carefully. You're asking me to what, exactly? Invest in your fertility venture? He smiled, triumphant, as though I had validated his vision simply by naming it. Not invest. Partner. Collaborate. We could change lives. Think of it as artisanal hope. The phrase landed heavily, absurd and eerie in equal measure. I looked at him across the candlelit table, at the pamphlet between us, at the neat stack of bread on the bruschetta plate, and felt a strange calm settle over me. There was no convincing him of the absurdity. His world was constructed on this logic, and within that world his proposal made sense. I was merely a character in his narrative, given a role without consent. I finished my pasta in silence, chewing slowly, letting him fill the air with his monologue. He spoke of scalability, branding, mentorship. He waved his knife for emphasis, the blade catching the candlelight, his enthusiasm growing with every sentence. His words flowed over me without landing, a torrent of conviction that refused to acknowledge reality. When the plates were cleared, he leaned back, satisfied. So, he said, folding his hands as though concluding a board meeting, what do you think? Will you join me? Will you make history? I smiled faintly. I think I'll have dessert. He blinked, momentarily thrown. The waitress returned, and I asked for tiramisu to go. She nodded without expression, though her eyes met mine briefly, and in that glance I sensed something, solidarity, perhaps, or pity. When the dessert arrived, boxed neatly, I stood. He remained seated, confusion flickering across his face, as though I had broken the script. I thanked him for dinner, handed him back the pamphlet, and left before he could reply. Outside, the night air was cool, grounding. The city hummed around me, indifferent to his proposal, to my refusal, to the absurdity of the evening. I walked home with the tiramisu in hand, its weight oddly comforting. In my kitchen, I ate it standing over the sink, the sweetness cutting through the residue of his words. Each bite felt like reclamation, a reminder that some things, joy, indulgence, life itself, cannot be packaged, branded, or sold. There are markets, and there are miracles. They do not share the same currency. The bar wasn't crowded, which should have been a comfort. Just a handful of couples leaning close at two tops, the low glow of pendant lamps turning every drink into a jewel. The place smelled faintly of lemon peel and varnished wood, a mixture of brightness and age. I'd chosen it because it was neutral. No history, no pretense, no chance of running into someone I knew. A safe stage for a first date. He was already there when I arrived, perched on a high stool with the posture of someone trying to look casual. He waved as if we were old friends spotting each other across a crowd. I smiled reflexively and slid onto the stool beside him. The bartender came over immediately, dropping napkins, and he ordered without hesitation 2 lemonades spiked with vodka. The choice was oddly wholesome, like something a summer camp counselor might have snuck into the mess hall. I didn't object. Lemonade is hard to hate. The first sips were bright and sharp, sugar and acid colliding on the tongue. We talked in the practiced rhythm of strangers testing compatibility. Jobs first, he explained his in a way that used all the right nouns but none of the verbs, as though his work was something that happened to him rather than something he did. I described mine with equal vagueness, abbreviating it into a sentence that felt like a business card. Then came travel, food, pets. He asked questions in the way of someone ticking boxes rather than following curiosity, but it was better than silence. The conversation coasted along, pleasant enough, until the subject shifted the way conversations sometimes do, abruptly, without logic, as if a hidden hand had flipped the page. I don't remember what led us there. Maybe it was a mention of hospitals in passing, maybe something about resilience. Whatever the bridge, I found myself saying it, that I'd had leukemia as a child. 3 years old. Too young to understand, old enough to remember in flashes. He blinked, took a sip of his drink, and then said, "Oh, that's not that bad." The words landed softly, almost kindly, but they carried a weight that pressed the air out of me. Not that bad. The room seemed to contract by degrees. The lights were no dimmer, the music no louder, yet everything pressed closer. I watched him as he continued drinking, unbothered, his expression open in the way of someone who believed he'd said something reasonable. I smiled because that's what I've been trained to do, smooth over awkwardness, protect the other person from the jaggedness of their own words. I said, "Well, I'm fine now." And that was true, in the way survival is technically true. But I wasn't fine, not in that moment. I remembered the wallpaper in the children's ward, faded balloons marching across yellow paint. I remembered the nurses who sang as they unhooked 4 lines, who could turn a sticker into a universe if they handed it to you with ceremony. I remembered the way adults spoke around me, switching to third person when they thought I wasn't listening. "She's a fighter. She's responding well. She might not make it." All of that lived in me still, and he had dismissed it with a phrase, as though leukemia at 3 were comparable to a scraped knee or a cancelled flight. I tried to explain gently. I told him about the long weeks, the hospital smells, the way I carried the weight of it long after the illness was gone. My words were careful, almost apologetic, as if sharing my history required permission. He nodded excessively, his head bobbing like a dashboard ornament, trying to project empathy without letting it actually land. "But still," he said brightly, "you're fine now. That's what matters." I looked at him, at the neat lines of his shirt, the glass sweating against his hand, and I realized he wasn't dismissing me out of cruelty. He was dismissing me out of convenience. My story was untidy, and he wanted it smoothed. He wanted the version that ended with triumph, not the one that included scars. I said nothing. Silence stretched, heavy and obvious, until he filled it with another anecdote about his co-workers. I let him. It was easier to drift back into the safe shallows of office politics than to stay in the deep water where my childhood floated like wreckage. We finished our drinks, and he asked if I wanted another. I declined. I said I had an early morning. We hugged briefly outside the bar, and he told me again how positive I was. The word hung between us like a balloon that had already started to deflate. Walking home, the night air tasted faintly of lemon, sour at the edges. I wondered how many times I had sanded down my own stories to spare someone from splinters they would never feel. I wondered how many times I had nodded, smiled, changed the subject, because the truth was too heavy for a table built for cocktails. At home, I called my mother. I asked her about the stickers the nurses had given me, whether she still remembered. She said yes, stars, dozens of them. I used to line them up on my dresser, tiny constellations that lost their stick over time, falling like failed promises to the carpet. She said I had loved them anyway, even when they no longer clung to anything. After the call, I sat quietly, turning the memory over in my hands. The man at the bar would never know what those stars meant. He would never understand that survival is not a clean line from sick to well, but a landscape you carry inside you, uneven and scarred, beautiful in ways that make no sense to others. My phone buzzed. A message from him. "You're so positive." I stared at the word until it unraveled. Positive. The thing my doctors told my parents in whispers. Positive. The test result that set the whole ordeal in motion. Positive. The adjective men use when they want to praise resilience without acknowledging its cost. I put the phone down without replying. The word echoed in my mind, empty and full at once, until finally it dissolved into nothing. In the weeks that followed, the memory lingered, not as a wound but as a reminder. I thought about the bar, about his easy dismissal, about my own reflexive smile. I thought about how much of survival is performance, not the fight itself, but the story you tell afterward, polished until it shines for other people's comfort. Sometimes late at night, I replay the moment when he said, "That's not that bad." I imagine myself responding differently, not with silence, not with a smile, but with the truth unvarnished. I imagine telling him that it was bad, that it shaped me, that it left echoes in my bones. I imagine watching his face as he realized some stories can't be reduced to neat lessons. But I didn't. I chose politeness. And maybe that too is survival. Still, I carry the memory of the stickers, of the stars that fell from my dresser, of the nurses who made universes out of scraps. That, more than anything, is what makes me fine now. Not his affirmation, not his shallow optimism, but the resilience of small kindnesses that mattered when nothing else did. The invitation had sounded simple enough. A rooftop bar downtown, the kind with fairy lights strung in zigzags overhead and cocktails named after constellations. I'd been once before, dragged there by friends, and remembered the view, the city stretching out in neat geometry, each window a small square of someone else's evening. It was the kind of place where people posed for photos against the skyline and pretended the hum of traffic below was applause. I arrived early because I always do. The elevator doors opened onto a room full of chatter, music pulsing politely just beneath conversation. The night air was warmer than it should have been for the season, thick with perfume and aftershave, laughter, and clinking glasses. I scanned the crowd, searching for her. She saw me first. Our eyes met across the bar, and in that instant I thought the evening might actually unfold the way plans sometimes do, smoothly without detours. But then her expression shifted, hardening into something unreadable. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the cluster of bodies near the railing. For a moment I thought I had misread the entire situation. Perhaps she hadn't wanted to meet at all. Perhaps this was her way of cutting it short before it began. I considered leaving. But the city was spread before me, glittering with the indifference of thousands of lives, and I found myself rooted to the spot. I ordered a drink, something citrus, garnished with a sprig of mint that looked tired, and sat at a small table near the edge, letting the skyline do its work. Minutes stretched. I checked my phone once, then again, though no messages arrived. The condensation on my glass slid down steadily, pooling on the napkin beneath. The crowd shifted around me. People arrived, people left, laughter swelled and fell like waves. Then my phone buzzed. A message from her. "You were rude to ignore me." I frowned, rereading the words as though they might rearrange themselves into something more coherent. I typed back, "I'm still here." "You walked away." A pause, then her reply, "You made me feel small." I stared at the screen, the words glowing like a warning. I looked around, half expecting to see a camera crew step out from behind the bar, some host with a microphone announcing the beginning of a social experiment. But there was no reveal, no audience. Just strangers sipping cocktails, their faces lit by strings of lights overhead. A balloon drifted upward from somewhere below, bumping against the railing before floating into the night. She reappeared 20 minutes later, moving through the crowd with deliberate steps, her chin raised in defiance. She stopped at my table, her eyes sharp. "You ignored me," she said flatly. "You left," I replied, keeping my tone calm, as though logic might anchor the conversation. Our words reached each other delayed, distorted, as if traveling through water. She folded her arms, her shoulders squared, and the rooftop air seemed to tilt around us. Conversations nearby grew louder, as though the night itself was trying to drown us out. "I don't like feeling invisible," she continued, her voice steady but threaded with something brittle. "If I came all the way here, the least you could do is acknowledge me." "I did," I said more softly than I intended. "You saw me. You looked right at me." Her eyes narrowed, the silence between us stretching taut. For a moment I thought she might laugh, dismiss it all as some misunderstanding. But instead she said, "You're unworthy." Not cruelly, not even dramatically. She said it the way someone might comment on the weather, an observation, not an attack. The words landed with a peculiar weight, heavier than the syllables themselves. Around us, the city gleamed indifferently, each window a reminder of other lives unfolding without us. A siren began somewhere below, rising in a key I almost recognized, weaving itself into the music overhead. I wanted to argue, to ask her what game she was playing, to demand an explanation for the strange choreography of the evening. But something in her tone made me hesitate. It wasn't anger exactly. It was certainty, the conviction of someone who had already written the ending and was simply delivering her lines. We stood there, facing each other across the small table, while the rooftop carried on around us. Strangers laughed, glasses clinked, the city hummed. And yet, in that moment, it felt as though the entire night had narrowed to just the two of us, caught in a play neither of us had auditioned for. Finally, she turned, her movement crisp, and walked toward the elevator. The crowd parted for her without resistance, as though they understood their role in her exit. She didn't look back. The doors closed behind her with a muted chime, and I was left alone at the table, the condensation from my forgotten drink soaking through the napkin. I sat there longer than I should have, replaying the sequence in my mind. The look on her face when she first saw me. The messages accusing me of rudeness, of making her feel small. The strange declaration of unworthiness. It all felt both petty and profound, as though a minor social mishap had been elevated into a cosmic judgment. Eventually, I stood, abandoning the half-empty glass, and made my way to the elevator. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected me back at myself, tired and bemused, rehearsing the expression of someone who leaves early, who lets the door swing shut without catching it. The lobby smelled faintly of lemons and endings, the cleaning staff already moving through with quiet efficiency. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had happened, which is its greatest mercy. Cars hissed past, a scooter whined down the street, a couple argued softly in the shadow of a lamppost. The world absorbed me without question, and I walked into it, grateful for its indifference. But the rooftop lingered. Not the drinks or the lights or the view, but the strangeness of her performance, the way she turned absence into accusation, the way she declared verdicts as if they were facts. It wasn't the pettiness that unsettled me. It was the way the night tilted, how quickly something ordinary became uncanny. For weeks afterward, I found myself replaying the evening in small fragments. The way she turned away at first sight, as though pulled by some invisible choreography. The text accusing me of rudeness, even as I sat waiting. The casual cruelty of "you're unworthy," spoken without heat, without hesitation. I told the story to friends, framing it as comedy. The absurdity of being scolded for existing, the surreal logic of rooftop accusations. They laughed, shaking their heads, assuring me I'd dodged something larger than I realized. And I laughed too, because that's what we do with stories that brush too close to something we can't name. We wrap them in humor so they don't unravel us. But alone, I thought about the word she chose. Unworthy. Not unattractive, not impolite, not disappointing. Unworthy. A word that implied some larger scale, some cosmic ledger I had been weighed against and found lacking. It felt less like an insult and more like a sentence, as though she had glimpsed something in me that I hadn't yet seen. We met in a bar where the lighting was designed to flatter, the kind that makes everyone prettier and less believable. The amber glow softened foreheads, erased blemishes, and blurred edges just enough to convince you that the stranger across the table could be someone you might actually know. He had the casual confidence of someone who thought he belonged in every room he entered, and for that night, I let myself believe it too. Our conversation skipped across safe surfaces, movies, work, music, like a stone thrown carefully to avoid sinking. He listened with the attentiveness of a man auditioning for reliability, nodding at intervals that were almost too precise, but not enough to ruin the effect. His laugh was slightly delayed, as if he waited to make sure he understood the joke before he committed. In the low hum of voices and the clink of glassware, I found myself relaxing. Nothing in his demeanor suggested the evening would end in anything but routine politeness. When he suggested we watch a movie at his place, I hesitated. I wasn't naive. I understood the implications. But his tone carried none of the aggressive push I had come to expect in similar invitations. He framed it casually, as if it were a continuation of our conversation rather than a proposition. "It's just down the street," he said. "I've got a projector set up. Makes everything feel like a theater." I agreed because it was easier than inventing a reason not to. His house was modest, forgettable from the outside, a square of siding and windows indistinguishable from its neighbors. Inside, It was cleaner than I expected, minimal decor, tidy kitchen counters, a couch that looked recently vacuumed. We settled into the living room, the projector casting a film across a blank wall, subtitles flickering softly in the dim light. For the first hour, nothing was amiss. He sat close but not too close, his body angled toward the screen rather than me. He didn't make unwelcome advances, didn't pepper the silence with innuendo. If anything, he seemed almost restrained, as though waiting for me to relax before showing more of himself. After the movie, he suggested we check something out in the basement. His voice was casual, but his eyes lingered on me in a way that unsettled. I stalled, asking why. He shrugged. I've been setting up a little space down there. It's different. You'll see. The stairs were narrow, the wood worn smooth by years of use. The handrail was sticky, as though painted too many times without ever fully drying. I followed him down, the air cooling as we descended, the smell shifting from domestic to something earthier. Concrete, dust, the faint musk of spaces that don't see daylight. The room below looked like a set. A mattress sat on pallets in one corner, covered with a thin sheet that didn't quite hide the stains beneath. A single tripod lamp cast harsh light, leaving the edges of the basement in shadow. On a workbench, coils of rope lay in neat spirals, next to duct tape, a pair of scissors, and a small metal box I didn't dare look into. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What is this?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound lighter than I felt. He smiled, not sheepishly, not apologetically, but with the satisfaction of someone unveiling a surprise. "A space," he said simply, as though that explained everything. He asked for my phone then, holding out his hand casually, as if requesting a pen. "So we can focus," he said. My pulse quickened. I hesitated too long, and he tilted his head, his smile sharpening. Reluctantly, I handed it over, telling myself I could retrieve it later, that refusing might escalate things too quickly. He placed it on the workbench, screen down like an offering. The door at the top of the stairs clicked shut. Not slammed, not locked with finality, just clicked, softly, politely, with the manners of a trap. He approached, lifting the rope with a kind of reverence. "Safe word." I joked, my tone brittle. He chuckled, as though indulging me, and brushed the rope against my wrist with practiced gentleness. The touch wasn't rough, but it was knowing. This wasn't his first time. I pulled back slightly. "I'm not comfortable with this," I said. My voice was steady, but inside, panic scratched at my ribs. He smiled again, calm, almost patient. "We've already started," he replied. The words landed heavy, as if the evening had been a contract signed in invisible ink. "There's a trick with fear. You hand it a job. If you let it roam freely, it tears through you like a wild animal. But if you give it something to do, count the exits, measure the space, track the rhythm of his breathing, it becomes useful." I counted. The distance to the stairs, 12 feet. The window above the workbench, small, probably sealed, but possible. His proximity, too close for running, not close enough to grab. I asked for the bathroom. My voice was calm, almost casual. He hesitated, suspicion flickering across his face. I held his gaze steady, as if my request was reasonable. Finally he relented. "Upstairs," he said, handing me nothing, no rope, no leash, just his eyes trailing me as I ascended the stairs. The upstairs hallway light felt like a ladder, every step carrying me closer to air. In the bathroom, I locked the door with hands that shook only after the bolt slid into place. I scanned the room, window above the toilet, small but just wide enough. My body moved before my mind could second guess, climbing awkwardly, knees slipping against porcelain. I shoved the window open, the cold night air rushing in like a rescue. I fed myself through the slot inch by inch, scraping my hip, bruising my thigh. The drop to the ground was harder than I expected, knocking the breath from me, but I didn't stop. I ran barefoot across the yard, the gravel biting, the air tearing at my throat. The neighborhood was dark and different, but a porch light flicked on as I passed, and I screamed, a sound so primal it startled me. A door opened, a neighbor's face pale with shock, and I stumbled toward it. Words tumbled out of me, basement, rope, phone, fragmented but enough. They pulled me inside, locked the door, called the police. Later, I watched from their window as officers led him out of his house. His face was calm, composed, the same expression he had worn when he arranged the rope on the workbench. He told them it was a misunderstanding, that we had been playing, that I had panicked. His words were smooth, practiced, the kind of lies that slide easily into official reports. The police listened, their expressions uniform and exhausted, the way professionals look when they've seen too many basements. They asked me questions, took my statement, retrieved my phone from the workbench. I answered everything, but the words felt detached, as if I were reading from a script someone else had written. In the days that followed, people asked what had happened, and I told them pieces. Enough to explain the bruises on my hip, enough to justify the nightmares, but not enough to recreate the silence of the basement, the weight of the rope brushing against my wrist. Some things can't be translated into safe language. What I remember most vividly isn't the sprint across the yard or the neighbor's porch light, but the moment he said, "We've already started." The certainty in his voice, the way he spoke as if consent were something you lost forever once given once. That's what haunts me, not the ropes, not the mattress, not the scissors, but the idea that he believed the story was his to write, that my only role was to play along. The bar was one of those places that tried to be casual, but carried just enough gloss to remind you it wanted to be taken seriously. Edison bulbs dangled overhead, glowing in filaments that hummed faintly. Chalkboard menus listed craft beers with names that sounded like inside jokes. Someone had glued the salt shakers to the tables, a prank I noticed only when I tried to shift one out of habit and found it immovable. The room buzzed with the easy laughter of strangers leaning into the promise of April. She sat across from me, a plate of nachos between us, the cheese stretched into long golden threads that broke reluctantly as we pulled them apart. Her eyes were calm, her smile steady, but when she leaned forward, I felt the atmosphere shift, as if the conversation had been waiting for this turn. "I have HSV," she said. Her voice was deliberate, unflinching, like a stone placed carefully in my hand. The words reached me just as someone at the bar let out a roar of laughter, and for a moment they collided, the roar and her calm confession, and my brain, stupidly, filed it under humor. My mouth betrayed me with a reflexive laugh, quick and sharp, before my better self could catch it. Her face closed, her smile shrinking into a small, tight line. "No," she said, softly but firmly. "It's not a bit." The sound in the room receded, as though the world wanted to give us privacy for this particular moment. I felt my stomach twist, not with disgust but with shame. My laugh still echoed between us like an unwanted guest. "I'm sorry," I said immediately, leaning forward, my words tumbling out too quickly. "I thought, April 1st, I thought maybe." Her eyes softened just slightly, but the hurt lingered. "It's not a prank," she repeated, quieter this time. I nodded, forcing myself to slow down, to let the weight of her words land properly. "Okay, thank you for telling me." She looked at me then, studying my face the way you study a map you aren't sure you can trust. I felt the need to prove myself, not with grand gestures but with steadiness. She explained, carefully, with the patience of someone who had done this before. She told me about rhythms, about cycles, about red excess and green checks on her internal calendar. She told me about medication, about statistics, about how disclosure wasn't just honesty but care. Her tone was calm, matter-of-fact, but beneath it I could feel the vulnerability. This was a part of herself she couldn't tuck away, couldn't disguise with makeup or charm. She was placing it in front of me, waiting to see if I would push it back across the table or accept it. I listened. I asked questions, not the selfish kind but the practical ones. How does it work? What does it mean in practice? What should I understand? Each answer she gave built a small bridge, plank by plank, across the gap my stupid laugh had created. We kept talking until the nachos cooled into brittle fossils on their plate. The bar shifted around us, people coming and going, the bartender swapping kegs, the jukebox looping back to the same songs. But our table felt insulated, suspended in a bubble of honesty. At one point, she asked if I wanted to leave, if I needed time to think. It was an out, a door left ajar. I shook my head. "I want to stay," I said, and for once the words felt uncalculated, pure in their simplicity. Something softened in her then. Not relief exactly, but recognition. A silent acknowledgement that I hadn't fled. When we finally stood to leave, the April night greeted us with a gentleness that felt deliberate. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. Streetlights glowed like low-hanging moons. On the sidewalk, a group of kids were playing with balloons left over from some party, popping them with exaggerated shrieks. One balloon burst with a sharp crack, and a boy doubled over laughing at his own fright. The laughter spread, contagious, untainted by shame. We walked side by side, our steps unconsciously in rhythm. She kept her hands in her pockets, but the space between us no longer felt fragile. It felt manageable, like something we could both inhabit without breaking it. At her car we paused. The silence wasn't awkward this time. It was full, comfortable, the kind of silence that holds more than words could. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that it mattered. She nodded, her smile returning, softer than before but more genuine. Later, I texted her, "Thank you for trusting me." Her reply came a few minutes later. A simple smile emoji, curved just slightly, but it felt like a door opening. Not wide, not all at once, but enough to step through if I chose. That night, lying in bed, I thought about disclosure, about how much of dating is theater, and how rare it is to encounter someone who refuses to act. Her words replayed in my mind, not as a confession, not as a burden, but as a gift. She had given me the chance to know her fully, to decide with eyes open. And I realized that what lingered wasn't the diagnosis, wasn't the risk, wasn't even the awkwardness of my initial mistake. What lingered was the glow of honesty itself, its strange, steady warmth. He promised to show me real music. That was the phrase he used, rolling it across his tongue like a secret password. Real music. The kind that, apparently, could not be found on playlists or radio, or in anything I had ever knowingly listened to before. I imagined vinyl records, maybe a crackling B-side discovered in a dusty crate, or some obscure jazz bootleg that only people with turntables and patience could appreciate. I thought I was being invited into a world of hidden artistry, something that would broaden my sense of taste. I didn't yet understand that what I was walking into was less about music and more about worship. His apartment smelled faintly of incense and candle wax, a sweetness too heavy for the small space. The curtains were drawn, and the flickering light of at least a dozen candles gave the room a strange, pulsing glow. It reminded me of a shrine or a seance, except the centerpiece wasn't a deity or relic. It was a Bluetooth speaker on the coffee table. "Sit," he said with a kind of reverence, gesturing toward the couch. I obeyed, sinking into cushions that felt worn with use, as though many others had sat through this ritual before me. He pressed play on his phone, and the room filled with the unmistakable voice of a red-haired pop star whose songs I'd heard hundreds of times in grocery stores and ride shares. At first, I thought he was joking. He closed his eyes, tilted his head back, and mouthed the lyrics with the surrender of someone receiving communion. The song built, sweet and predictable, and he whispered, "Listen to this bridge. Just listen." I did. I listened as the chorus swelled exactly where I expected it to. His eyes shimmered with tears, his chest rising as if he were breathing in something holy. He stood then, unable to stay seated, and began to move, not dancing exactly but performing. His hand pressed to his heart, his other arm raised skyward, his body rocking as though the music were pulling strings inside him. I watched, uncertain whether to laugh or applaud. There was an earnestness in him that defied mockery. His devotion was too naked, too sincere, to be funny. It was absurd, yes, but also unsettling, because it suggested the music wasn't just background to him, it was belief. Song after song played, each one melting into the next, a sugary river that seemed endless. He knew every word, every inflection, every pause in the singer's voice. At times he closed his eyes and whispered along, as though the lyrics were spells. At others, he looked at me with a feverish intensity, as if daring me to admit I wasn't being transformed. "Do you feel it?" he asked, breathless after one particularly soaring chorus. I smiled faintly. I feel something that seemed to satisfy him. He knelt in front of me then, still swaying with the music, and placed his hands gently on my knees. His face was so close I could smell the faint salt of his sweat mixed with incense smoke. The intimacy startled me, not because of what it was, but because of how naturally it seemed to flow from his devotion to the music itself. "Open yourself to it," he murmured. His fingers traced slow patterns on my thighs, not urgent, not demanding, but insistent in their own rhythm, keeping time with the song. It was surreal, the way he blurred the line between seduction and sermon. His touch wasn't about me so much as about pulling me deeper into his ritual. I let him, maybe out of curiosity, maybe because there was something strangely intoxicating about his conviction. He leaned closer, his breath hot against my skin, whispering fragments of lyrics as though they were scripture. His lips brushed my knee, then my thigh, not lingering long enough to be obscene but enough to shift the air in the room. The music carried us. Each song seemed to dictate the pace of his movements, the rise and fall of his hands, the grazing warmth of his mouth. It wasn't passion in the usual sense. It was choreography dictated by a pop star who would never know his devotion. When the tempo slowed, so did he. When it surged, his touch became bolder, his body pressing closer, his words tumbling faster. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to feel what he felt, to surrender as fully as he had. The candles flickered, shadows swayed, and his voice whispered the chorus against my skin. For a fleeting instant, I understood. This wasn't just lust or fandom. It was transcendence, absurd and unsettling, but real to him. He pulled back suddenly, tears streaking his face, and collapsed onto the couch beside me. He grabbed my hand, clutching it tightly, and whispered, "This is the truth. This is what people don't get. This music, it's pure. It's better than sex. It's better than anything." I almost laughed then, not because I wanted to mock him, but because the irony was so sharp. He was pressed against me, trembling, his hands roaming as if searching for purchase, and yet he swore the music was greater than any of it. His body betrayed him even as his words glorified the chorus. When he kissed me, it was clumsy, wet with tears, his lips moving in sync with the song rather than with me. I let him kiss me, but it felt less like affection, and more like worship conducted through my body. His hands slid under my shirt, tracing the outline of ribs as though reading Braille, and he whispered again, "Do you feel it?" I didn't answer, because what I felt wasn't the same as what he felt, and I knew that saying so would break something fragile. The music looped, one song bleeding into another, the same voice, the same tone, the same message repackaged a dozen ways. I wondered how many others had sat on this couch, in this shrine of candles, with his hands trembling against them as he sought to convert. When finally the playlist ended, the silence was shocking, almost violent. He sat back, breath ragged, and wiped his face with both hands. The absence of sound left us exposed, stripped of the sugar-sweet curtain that had cloaked everything. "Now you understand," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't argue. I only smiled faintly, and he seemed content with that. When I left, he pressed his phone into my hand long enough to load a playlist, hundreds of songs curated like scripture, the same voice in endless variations. "For you," he said, as though bestowing a relic. On the street, the night had the decency to be out of tune. Cars hissed, brakes screeched, a dog barked in uneven rhythm. A couple fought half-heartedly in the distance, their words tripping over each other with no chorus to steady them. It was chaotic, human, real. I walked home listening not to his playlist, but to the city's discord, grateful for its. They tell me I talk too much about energy, but how can you talk too much about the only thing that's real? You can strip away money, politics, names, even flesh, and what are you left with? Vibration. Frequency. The hum beneath everything. That's what I see when I walk into a restaurant like this one. Candles glowing as though they're coded beacons. The hum of refrigeration units beneath the floorboards sending out a signal everyone ignores except me. She sits across from me, polite in that way people are on first dates, nodding like she's listening, but I can tell she doesn't yet understand the magnitude of what I'm offering. I lean forward, lowering my voice so the others around us don't hear too much. Some knowledge has to be guarded, rationed carefully, otherwise you risk opening doors for people who aren't ready. I tell her about the streetlights, how the government tunes them to a frequency that interferes with the pineal gland, calcifies it, blocks higher consciousness. Most people roll their eyes at that, but she doesn't. She watches me, fork poised in midair like an antenna, and that tells me she knows. Maybe not consciously, but her body knows. She eats quietly while I speak, and quiet is respect. People don't realize that. They think silence means disinterest, but really it's resonance. Her silence means she's aligning. I tell her how I've experimented with weed, not the cheap kind, but the kind grown under specific light spectrums, and how it opens some doors while locking others. Balance, I explain, is the key. You can't just blow every circuit at once. You have to tune yourself, like a radio, until you catch the right frequency. She nods, takes another sip of her drink, and the way she swallows tells me she's absorbing not just liquid but truth. I lean closer, whispering now because there are ears everywhere, waiters, bartenders, the couple at the next table pretending to argue about wine but really logging our conversation for the data banks. I tell her molecules are tiny promises, bonds vibrating against one another, and that we are nothing but large molecules pretending to be solid. Her eyes flick briefly to her fork again, tracing the tines as though she sees the Morse code etched there. That's how the message gets through, not with words, but with recognition. People call me paranoid, but paranoia is just pattern recognition in high definition. When I point to the streetlight outside the window and explain how its hum is pitched to the exact frequency of cellular disruption, she doesn't laugh. She looks, she really looks, and that's when I know she's hearing it too, even if she won't admit it yet. The check comes, And of course she tries to pay quickly, sliding her card into the folder before I can protest. Most people would think she's being polite, but I know better. She's saving me. She knows capitalism is a trap, a net woven of invisible threads that bind us the moment we participate. By paying, she's keeping me clean, sparing me the frequency of debt and transaction. I let her because generosity is part of balance, and balance always demands acceptance. We stand outside afterward, the night air vibrating with the low thrum of transformers hidden in the street lamps. I light a cigarette, not because I need it, but because fire is one of the original elements, one of the pure frequencies before they started corrupting them with LEDs and wireless signals. The ember glows the same color as the threat in the bulbs above, and I point to it, showing her the connection. She nods, her expression unreadable, but nods are always alignment. She hugs me goodbye like a doctor delivering bad news. Gentle but distant, the kind of touch meant to soften what can't really be softened. Still, I can feel her aura brushing mine, a flicker of recognition, and I know she'll think about me later, in the quiet, when the frequencies aren't so loud. She walks away, her shoulders squared as though she's shielding herself, and I watch her until she turns the corner. That's when I remember I didn't give her the pamphlet. I'd worked on it for weeks, diagrams of light spectra, charts of vibration rates, graphs showing how water molecules shift when exposed to certain words. Proof, tangible proof, the kind that converts skeptics. But maybe it's better this way. Proof can overwhelm people. Sometimes it's enough to plant the idea and let it grow like a seed, watered by the hum of the streetlights she'll notice now every time she walks home. I take one last drag of the cigarette, flick the ember into the gutter, and watch it flare before dying. Balance. That's what it always comes back to. People think I talk too much about energy, but energy is the only thing that talks back. She told me before we met that she loved cats, but people say that so often it barely registers. Loving cats is like loving coffee or the beach. It feels universal, unremarkable. But when she stepped into my apartment and crouched to greet Theo and Peaches, I realized she hadn't been exaggerating. She dropped to the floor without hesitation, knees bent, palms out, eyes wide. She didn't coo or make noises. She simply waited, still as a stone, letting them approach on their own terms. Theo, dignified as always, gave her the slow, appraising blink of a monarch deciding whether to accept an emissary. Peaches, predictably, hurled herself into her lap within seconds, a little gremlin desperate for affection. The woman, her name was Miranda, laughed, not the high, forced laugh of someone trying to endear themselves, but a low, genuine sound, rich and unself-conscious. She stroked Peach's fur with both hands, whispering something inaudible, her face softening in a way that felt almost private. For the next hour, she existed entirely on the floor. I offered her a drink, a seat on the couch, but she waved me off. "I'm fine here," she said, as Theo finally patted closer, permitting her to scratch under his chin. Watching her, I felt oddly displaced, as though I were the guest in my own apartment and she the host. The new kitten, still unnamed, a recent rescue with oversized ears and a tentative gait, emerged cautiously from under the chair. Miranda's eyes widened as though she'd spotted a miracle. She lowered herself until her cheek almost touched the carpet, extending a single hand. The kitten sniffed, hesitated, then pressed its tiny head into her palm. She gasped softly, and I realized it wasn't a gasp of surprise but recognition, as though something inevitable had finally occurred. She scooped him up gently, cradling him against her chest. He relaxed almost immediately, a limp noodle of trust, purring faintly. Miranda rocked him slightly, her expression shifting from joy to something stranger, an intensity that unsettled me. "He wants to come with me," she said suddenly. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "He's telling me," she continued, stroking his fur with deliberate slowness. "He's choosing me." I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was joking. "He lives here," I reminded her, reaching out my hand as though she might hand him back like a borrowed object. But she held him tighter, her grip protective, almost possessive. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time that evening, I saw a shadow of something harder beneath her warmth. "I thought you were letting me adopt him," she said, her tone steady but edged. "No," I said carefully, my voice calm but firm. "That was never the plan." The air in the room cooled by an imperceptible degree. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder, the ticking of the clock sharper. She continued to rock the kitten, who looked at me over her shoulder with wide, unbothered eyes. "Look at him," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "He's so calm with me. He knows." "He's calm with everyone," I replied. He's a kitten. She frowned, her mouth tightening. For a long moment, we held each other's gaze across the room, the kitten cradled like contraband between us. It felt absurd, almost comedic, and yet the seriousness in her posture made laughter impossible. Finally, she loosened her grip. With a ceremonial slowness, she extended the kitten toward me. I took him carefully, the transfer delicate, like passing a password. He nestled against my chest, purring louder now, as though indifferent to the tension he had caused. Miranda rose to her feet. She smoothed her dress, her composure returning like a mask settling back into place. At the door, she turned, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You'll never love him like I would," she said quietly. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, because sometimes words only feed a fire. She held my gaze for a beat longer, then stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound precise, final. The apartment exhaled when she left. Theo returned to his perch by the window, peaches twined around my ankle like a comma, and the kitten blinked up at me with an innocence that felt almost mocking. That night, as I sat with them, the scene replayed in my mind, not as comedy, not as farce, but as something uncanny. The way she had spoken, certain that the kitten had chosen her. The conviction in her voice, the way she blurred the line between affection and ownership. It wasn't theft, not exactly, but it wasn't far from it either. I dreamed of bookshelves rearranged while I slept, all the titles about endings placed at eye level. I dreamed of doors opening and cats walking through them, choosing other homes without explanation. When I woke, the apartment was unchanged, but the dream left a residue, a faint unease. In the days that followed, I half expected her to return, to knock on the door with some excuse. She never did. But sometimes, when I looked at the kitten, I thought of her words, "He wants to come with me." And I wondered if part of her believed it so deeply that she would keep living as though he had. I bought him new treats, new toys, small rituals to anchor him here. Theo accepted him with the dignity of a monarch tolerating a successor. Peaches remained a gremlin, uninterested in the politics of belonging. The kitten thrived, growing into himself, unaware of the tug-of-war he had once inspired. The kayak moved easily at first, slicing the water with a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. Each stroke dipped and rose, the blades dripping silver under the late afternoon sun. The tide was calm, though the air carried the kind of heaviness that warns of dusk. Half a mile from shore, the world had already begun to feel different, smaller, quieter, bound by nothing but water and horizon. That's when we saw it. A disturbance near the reeds, something struggling against the surface. At first I thought it was debris caught in the tide, a bag snagged on a branch. But as we drew closer, the shape sharpened into feathers, and then into a body, sleek and dark, thrashing with wild, desperate energy. A loon. It was tangled in fishing line, the bright synthetic threads cutting across its throat, wings trapped in a cruel geometry of knots. Its eyes were furious, prehistoric in their defiance, and when we pulled alongside, it thrashed harder, its cries sharp enough to slice the air. I cupped the bird in my hands, or tried to. Its heart hammered against my palms like a fist, and I felt every ounce of its terror pulse through me. My companion leaned over carefully, unwinding the line with slow, deliberate movements. The threads resisted, biting into the bird's feathers, clinging as though unwilling to release their hold. I murmured something. I don't remember what, only that the sound was meant to soothe, even though I knew the loon couldn't understand. The bird quieted only when exhaustion overtook it, its body going limp in my grip while its eyes still blazed with fury. At last, the final strand came free, and my companion lifted the tangled mass of line into the air, a bright, ugly snake that seemed absurdly small given the damage it had done. We paddled back, carrying the loon carefully between us. The shore felt miles away, the silence of the water pressing down with new weight. I thought of the bird's frantic heartbeat, the way its fear had bled into my own. I couldn't tell if it had trusted me or simply resigned itself. On the beach, the rehabilitators met us. They wore heavy gloves and the calm of people who had seen too much and kept going anyway. They took the loon gently, speaking to it in low, steady tones, their movements efficient but kind. "You did right," one of them said, glancing at us. Their words landed with warmth, but also distance. Doing right didn't erase the image of the fishing line cutting into flesh, the panic in the bird's eyes. We watched them carry it away, the loon's head twitching weakly, its cry reduced to a low rasp. When they disappeared into their building, we stood for a moment longer, listening to the waves lap against the sand. The sky had begun to bruise, streaked purple and gray. The walk back to the car was quiet. Neither of us spoke, though I could feel the weight of what we'd just witnessed pressing between us. We passed a half-built sandcastle, its towers slumping under the tide, abandoned mid-construction. It looked like something half-remembered, undone by time and neglect. "Coffee?" he asked finally, his voice careful, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile silence. I shook my head. "Not tonight." He nodded, and that was the end of it. We parted at the parking lot with a nod. No hug, no kiss, no suggestion of a second date. The loon had changed the shape of the evening, turned what was supposed to be light and flirtatious into something heavy, almost ceremonial. That night, I lay awake with the sound of the loon's cry echoing in my head. It was a sound both wild and human, an animal sound that spoke of pain but carried something deeper, something older. I dreamed of fishing line, of invisible threads looping around my own throat, binding my arms until I could no longer move. I woke with my hands clenched, my chest tight. The rehabilitators never told us what happened after. Maybe the loon survived. Maybe it didn't. Either way, its heart had beaten against mine, and that was enough to make it unforgettable. Some dates end with laughter, others with disappointment, some with sex. This one ended with silence and a bird's furious heartbeat, and somehow that felt truer than anything else could have. My name is Tinderley. At roll call, teachers pause like they're tasting the syllables for the first time, stretching them across their tongues as though pronunciation alone might save me. Kids don't bother with that much care. They call me Swipe, Matchbox app. They hum fake notification sounds when I walk by. The names sting less than the silence that follows, the heavy reminder that my name is a monument to decisions I had no part in. Mom says she named me after destiny. A spark, she tells people at parties, glass of wine in hand. A spark that started everything. She smiles when she says it, proud and wistful at the same time, like she thinks the story is romantic. Dad never explains. He doesn't say much at all anymore, except in the birthday cards he mails from a different city, signed with a scrawl that looks more like apology than love. At school on career day, the other kids bring props. Plastic stethoscopes, firefighter helmets, clipboards. I bring a shoebox full of red flags. Each one is a square of construction paper taped to a stick, and when I set the box on my desk, the class titters. But I stand anyway, lifting one flag after another, explaining how my name taught me early to notice things. Red flags are warnings, I tell them. Patterns you learn to see before they swallow you. The teacher forces a smile, her eyes darting to the clock. The guidance counselor calls me resilient. That's what adults always say when they've broken something they can't fix. Resilient is code for we left you out in the rain and you're still standing. She pats my shoulder, soft and careful, like she's worried I'll crack if she presses too hard. At home, Mom scrolls through her phone while dinner burns on the stove. I've seen her dating profile. Not on purpose, but once when she left it open, glowing on the counter like a confession. She still uses photos from when she was younger, filters smudging out the years. Her bio reads, Proud Mom. Believer in sparks. Sometimes I wonder if she swipes past men who might remember me, who might recognize the name. Above the sink hangs a photo from when I was a toddler, both my parents crouched on either side of me, their smiles bright, the world filtered into a sunset so unreal it could only have been digitally conjured. Mom says that picture was taken the day they matched, that fate arranged it all. The algorithm brought us together, she says, and her eyes shine like she still believes it. I once asked her if fate has a customer service line, someone you can call when things go wrong. She laughed at first, but then she looked at the sink with an expression I didn't recognize, like a horizon she couldn't reach. By 12, I learned to rename myself. Not legally, not in any way that shows up on paperwork. Paperwork likes permanence, likes to remind you of the past. But in secret, in art class, I sign my drawings with another word. A verb. A name that doesn't pin me to an app, that doesn't echo with laughter from kids in hallways. I keep that name tucked away like a country of my own, small and fragile, but mine. I start imagining museums. Exhibits titled almost Swipe Right History, The Children of Sparks. Notes from boys who liked my laugh but not my laugh lines, from girls who said they admired my mind but not my opinions. Glass cases filled with screenshots, arranged like fossils. In one room, a docent explains how we cultivate girls to host discomfort like a guest we're obligated to feed. In another, a looping video of faces swiping, 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 never stopping to ask who might be born of those gestures. One afternoon, I tell a friend about my name. She laughs at first, then stops when she sees my face. That's cruel, she says. I want to tell her it's not cruelty exactly. It's longing, dressed up as romance. My mother thought she was naming me after fire. She didn't realize she was naming me after kindling. When I'm older, maybe 16, Mom will tell me again about that night. About how she matched with Dad, how they messaged for days, how they stayed up until sunrise talking about everything and nothing. She'll say it was electric, like touching a socket. She'll say naming me Tinderlay was proof that their spark became something living. I'll nod, because I'm good at the choreography of politeness. But inside, I'll be thinking about how sparks are beautiful only for a second before they vanish, leaving smoke and dark behind. Until then, I practice choosing myself. Small acts, like saying no when someone asks for my homework, or yes when I want something but feel afraid to ask. It feels awkward, earnest, like learning to whistle. But one day, I think, it will sound like music. At night, I stand at my bedroom window and look at the stars. I wonder how many of them are dead already, their light still traveling here long after they burned out. Sparks, I realize, don't last. But constellations, those are stories we choose to keep, no matter how much time passes. 3:47 p.m., text from Marina. Model, allegedly, though I only knew that from the way she said it, not from anything I'd seen. Leave work early? $500 in flowers. 3:48 p.m., my reply. That's not necessary? 3:49 p.m., Venmo buzzed. Plus $500. Note, Rose. 4:11 p.m., doorbell rang. She stood there with the kind of energy that filled space without asking permission. The peonies in her hand were a shade of pink so exaggerated it felt impossible, like someone had adjusted the saturation on reality. She stepped inside without hesitation, without waiting for me to say yes. The money sat heavy in my pocket, a hot coin I hadn't asked for. I set the flowers in a vase, and the room suddenly looked dressed for an occasion I didn't understand. Line items. Peonies free hers. Time, expensive mine. Meaning, unclear ours. We sat, each with a glass of something citrus I poured to keep my hands busy. She complimented the mug I used, turning it slowly in her fingers as though examining a relic. I returned the compliment with the safest weapon available, admiration for her audacity. She laughed, and the laugh was sharp, precise, the kind that cuts a room into neat rectangles. Think of it as a gesture, she said. She meant the flowers, the money, maybe even herself. Gesture as weather, unasked for but impossible to ignore. I tried handing the envelope back. She pushed it toward me again, her manicured nails tapping the paper lightly, as though testing its ripeness. Keep it, she insisted. It's easier that way. The words were simple, but the way she said them left a residue. Easier for whom? Easier how? By 5:02 p.m. she was in my living room, legs folded casually, posture relaxed. Everything about her felt rehearsed, as though this was a performance she'd given before, a play in which my role was interchangeable. She asked if I'd ever been photographed by someone who truly saw me. I wanted to laugh. It sounded like seduction, but the tone was closer to recruitment. She talked about light, about composition, about how truth hides in angles. Her voice was soft, persuasive, sliding between sincerity and sales pitch. Every time I tried to place it, she moved on, leaving me chasing shadows. 6:20 p.m., arithmetic exhaustion. I called an early night. She stretched, yawned prettily, and stood. At the door, she turned, her eyes flicking to the flowers. Keep them, she said, as though it were an instruction rather than kindness. Then she was gone, the hallway swallowing her footsteps. The flowers remained. Too pink, too alive, too loud for my kitchen. They looked like money transfigured into something breathing, as though cash, once offered and refused, had to find another form. Line items. Gesture, heavy. Conversation, uneven. Flowers, still here. That night, I sat staring at them in the half-light. They tilted in their vase, absurdly regal, their petals unfolding with a quiet persistence. I thought of her words, "Have you ever been photographed by someone who truly sees you?" And I wondered if that was what this all was. Not a date, not even an exchange, but a test, a rehearsal for some other performance she'd deliver to someone else tomorrow. The money remained in my account, untouched. I didn't spend it, didn't move it, didn't delete the notification. It sat there like a splinter under skin, too small to cause damage but impossible to ignore. By morning, the peonies had opened wider, leaning toward the window, their impossible pink now edging toward something softer, more vulnerable. I left them there, unable to throw them out, unwilling to claim them as mine. Line items. Her gone. Me uncertain. Flowers alive.